Gaslighting is one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation designed to make you question your own reality, memory, and sanity. The term originates from the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she's losing her mind. This tactic involves persistent denial of facts, rewriting history, and contradicting your experiences. A gaslighter will tell you things like, "That never happened, you're being too sensitive," or "You're remembering it wrong." They'll move your belongings and deny doing so, make promises they never keep while insisting they never made them, and gradually erode your confidence in your own perceptions. The process is gradual and subtle. It starts with small contradictions that seem insignificant, making you second-guess minor details. Over time, these challenges to your reality become more frequent and significant. You begin to rely on the manipulator to tell you what's real, effectively surrendering your autonomy. Victims often experience confusion, anxiety, and a constant feeling of walking on eggshells. They lose trust in their own judgment and become increasingly dependent on the gaslighter's version of events. This creates a power dynamic where the manipulator holds all the cards. To protect yourself, document important conversations, trust your instincts, and maintain connections with supportive friends and family who can provide reality checks. Remember that your feelings and perceptions are valid, and anyone who consistently makes you question your sanity may be employing this dangerous manipulation tactic. Brainwashing represents the systematic breakdown and reconstruction of an individual's belief system, personality, and identity. Originally studied in the context of prisoner-of-war camps and totalitarian regimes, this extreme form of psychological manipulation has found its way into cults, abusive relationships, and coercive organizations. The process typically begins with isolation from familiar environments, support systems, and information sources. Victims are cut off from family, friends, and independent media, creating a controlled information bubble. This isolation makes individuals more susceptible to influence and reduces their ability to reality check new information. Physical and emotional stress play crucial roles in breaking down psychological defenses. Sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, repetitive tasks, and constant criticism create mental exhaustion. When the mind is overwhelmed and depleted, it becomes more accepting of new ideas and less capable of critical thinking. The reconstruction phase involves repetitive indoctrination, where new beliefs are introduced through constant repetition, emotional manipulation, and reward systems. Compliance is rewarded while resistance is punished, creating powerful conditioning that shapes behavior and thought patterns. Victims gradually adopt new identities that align with their captors' or manipulators' goals. They may genuinely believe in ideologies they previously rejected, defend their abusers, and actively resist rescue attempts. This isn't weakness, it's a survival mechanism that helps them cope with an impossible situation. Recovery requires patience, professional support, and gradual reintegration with healthy relationships and environments. Understanding that brainwashing exploits normal psychological processes can help victims recognize they're not broken, but rather responding predictably to extreme manipulation. Love bombing is an overwhelming display of attention, affection, and adoration designed to quickly establish emotional dependence and control. This manipulation tactic floods the target with excessive praise, gifts, constant communication, and declarations of love that seem too good to be true, because they are. The love bomber showers you with compliments like, "You're perfect," "I've never met anyone like you," or "We're soulmates" within days or weeks of meeting. They text constantly, want to spend every moment together, and make grand romantic gestures that sweep you off your feet. This intense attention feels incredible and creates a powerful emotional high. This technique exploits our natural desire for connection and validation. The overwhelming positivity creates a biochemical addiction. Your brain releases dopamine and oxytocin, creating genuine feelings of euphoria and attachment. You become dependent on this emotional high, craving more of their attention and approval. The love bomber studies your vulnerabilities, insecurities, and desires, then presents themselves as the perfect solution to all your needs. They mirror your interests, share your values, and seem to understand you completely. This creates a false sense of compatibility and destiny. Once you're emotionally hooked, the love bombing gradually decreases, leaving you confused and desperate to recapture those initial feelings. You'll work harder to please them, accept worse treatment, and overlook red flags because you remember how amazing things were in the beginning. Healthy relationships develop gradually with consistent but reasonable displays of affection. Be wary of anyone who claims to love you immediately, wants to move extremely fast, or makes you feel like you're in a fairy tale rather than real life. Guilt tripping is a manipulative tactic that weaponizes your conscience, empathy, and sense of responsibility to control your behavior. The manipulator makes you feel responsible for their emotions, problems, or well-being, creating artificial guilt that compels you to comply with their wishes. Common guilt-tripping phrases include, "After everything I've done for you, you're so selfish, I guess I don't matter to you," or "You're breaking my heart." They might recount past favors, exaggerate their sacrifices, or claim you're hurting them by not doing what they want. This tactic exploits your natural empathy and desire to be a good person. When someone suggests you're causing them pain or being ungrateful, your conscience kicks in, making you feel genuinely bad. This emotional discomfort motivates you to change your behavior to alleviate the guilt. Guilt trippers often play the victim, portraying themselves as long-suffering and unappreciated. They might cry, sulk, or give you the silent treatment until you cave to their demands. They turn every disagreement into evidence of your moral failings or lack of caring. Over time, this manipulation erodes your ability to set boundaries, make independent decisions, or prioritize your own needs. You become hypervigilant about their feelings while neglecting your own well-being. Every choice becomes about whether it will upset them rather than what's right for you. Healthy relationships involve mutual respect for boundaries and individual autonomy. People who consistently make you feel guilty for having your own opinions, needs, or limits are prioritizing control over your happiness. Learning to distinguish between appropriate guilt and manufactured guilt is essential for maintaining your emotional freedom and self-respect. Cultivating dependence is a systematic process of making someone increasingly reliant on you for their emotional, financial, social, or practical needs. This manipulation creates a power imbalance where the victim becomes afraid to leave or assert independence because they believe they cannot survive without the manipulator. The process often begins subtly, with the manipulator positioning themselves as helpful and indispensable. They offer to handle your finances, make important decisions, or manage your relationships with others. Initially, this seems caring and supportive, but gradually you lose the skills, confidence, and resources to function independently. Financial dependence is particularly powerful. The manipulator might discourage you from working, control access to money, or create financial obligations that tie you to them. They ensure you don't have the resources to leave, making you economically trapped in the relationship. Social isolation is another key component. The manipulator gradually separates you from friends, family, and support networks. They might create conflicts with your loved ones, demand exclusive attention, or relocate you away from familiar environments. Without outside perspectives and support, you become increasingly dependent on them for social connection and validation. Emotional dependence develops as the manipulator becomes your primary source of comfort, guidance, and self-worth. They position themselves as the only person who truly understands or cares about you, making you feel lost and vulnerable without their presence. The victim eventually believes they're incapable of functioning alone, even when they previously were independent and competent. Breaking free requires gradually rebuilding confidence, reconnecting with support systems, and developing practical skills. Remember that dependence was artificially created. Your capability for independence still exists beneath the manufactured helplessness. Learned helplessness occurs when repeated exposure to uncontrollable, negative situations teaches someone to accept defeat even when escape or resistance becomes possible. This psychological phenomenon transforms naturally resilient people into passive victims who stop fighting back, believing their efforts are futile. The concept was first observed in laboratory experiments where dogs receiving inescapable electric shocks eventually stopped trying to escape even when barriers were removed. Similarly, humans subjected to consistent manipulation, abuse, or control often develop this same resignation, accepting mistreatment as inevitable. Manipulators cultivate learned helplessness by ensuring that resistance is consistently punished or proves futile. They might ignore your protests, escalate abuse when you fight back, or create situations where every choice leads to negative consequences. Over time, you learn that fighting back only makes things worse. This conditioning creates a mental state where victims genuinely believe they have no options or power to change their circumstances. They may have resources, support, or opportunities available but cannot see or utilize them because they've been programmed to expect failure. The psychological impact extends beyond the immediate situation. Victims often develop depression, anxiety, and a general sense of powerlessness that affects all areas of life. They may stop pursuing goals, avoid taking risks, or fail to recognize genuine opportunities for improvement. Recovery involves gradually rebuilding a sense of personal agency and effectiveness. Small successes in low-stakes situations can help restore confidence in your ability to influence outcomes. Professional therapy can help identify and challenge the thought patterns that maintain helplessness. Understanding learned helplessness helps explain why intelligent, capable people sometimes remain in obviously harmful situations. It's not weakness, but a predictable response to systematic conditioning. Stockholm Syndrome describes the psychological phenomenon where victims develop positive feelings, empathy, or even affection for their captors or abusers. Named after a 1973 bank robbery in Stockholm where hostages defended their captors, this response represents a survival mechanism that can occur in various abusive situations. The syndrome develops when several conditions are present. The victim perceives a threat to survival, experiences small kindnesses from the abuser, is isolated from other perspectives, and believes escape is impossible. Under these conditions, the mind adopts a strategy of aligning with the aggressor to increase chances of survival. In abusive relationships, this manifests as defending the abuser, minimizing their harmful behavior, and feeling grateful for moments of kindness or reduced cruelty. Victims might say things like, "He's not always like this," or "She really does love me," despite overwhelming evidence of abuse. The psychological mechanism involves the victim's need to find meaning and maintain hope in a hopeless situation. By viewing the abuser as complex rather than purely evil, they preserve the possibility of redemption and better treatment. This cognitive adjustment helps them psychologically survive ongoing trauma. Stockholm Syndrome is particularly confusing for observers who cannot understand why the victim doesn't simply leave or fight back. However, from the victim's perspective, survival seems to depend on maintaining the abuser's goodwill, making resistance feel dangerous. Recovery requires gradually rebuilding connections with supportive people who can provide reality checks and alternative perspectives. Professional counseling helps victims understand that their survival responses were adaptive under impossible circumstances, but they can now choose different strategies. Recognizing Stockholm Syndrome helps explain why victims sometimes resist rescue attempts or return to abusive situations. Their psychological survival strategies may be stronger than their desire for freedom. Memory manipulation involves altering, distorting, or fabricating memories to serve the manipulator's agenda. Human memory is surprisingly malleable, and skilled manipulators exploit this vulnerability to rewrite history, implant false memories, or make you doubt your recollections of events. This tactic often combines with gaslighting but goes further by actively creating false memories rather than simply denying true ones. The manipulator might repeatedly tell detailed stories about events that never happened, gradually convincing you that you remember them too. They exploit the fact that repeated exposure to false information can create genuine memory traces. They might also distort real memories by changing key details. Perhaps they acknowledge something happened but change who was responsible, what was said, or the sequence of events. Over time, these altered versions can replace your original memories, especially if they're reinforced through repetition and emotional manipulation. Photo manipulation, fabricated documents, or false witnesses can provide evidence supporting the manipulator's version of events. When external sources seem to confirm false information, even strong memories can be shaken. The manipulator might show you doctored photos or create fake text messages to support their narrative. Childhood memories are particularly vulnerable because they're less concrete and often rely on others' accounts. Manipulative parents or caregivers can implant false memories of events, relationships, or even abuse that never occurred, creating lasting psychological damage. Protecting yourself involves documenting important events, maintaining relationships with trustworthy people who can provide independent verification, and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Keep journals, save messages, and don't rely solely on your memory for important interactions. Understanding memory's malleability doesn't mean all memories are false, but recognizing this vulnerability helps you stay vigilant against those who would exploit it. Fear-mongering is the deliberate cultivation of fear to control behavior, suppress dissent, or motivate compliance. Manipulators use this tactic to make you feel constantly threatened, creating anxiety that makes you dependent on their protection or guidance while preventing rational decision-making. The fearmonger identifies your vulnerabilities, concerns about safety, security, relationships, or future prospects, then amplifies these fears far beyond reasonable proportions. They might exaggerate dangers, focus exclusively on worst-case scenarios, or present themselves as the only solution to impending doom. Common fear-mongering phrases include, "Something terrible will happen if you don't listen to me, everyone is against you except me, you can't trust anyone else," or "The world is more dangerous than you realize." They create a sense of urgency that prevents careful consideration of options. This manipulation exploits your brain's threat detection system. When you feel afraid, your amygdala triggers fight or flight responses that override logical thinking. In this state, you're more likely to accept the manipulator's solutions without questioning their validity or considering alternatives. Fearmongers often position themselves as your protector or the only source of accurate information about threats. They claim special knowledge or insight that others lack, making you dependent on their expertise. This creates a cycle where questioning them feels dangerous because it might leave you vulnerable. The constant state of fear is exhausting and clouds judgment. You become hyper-vigilant about imaginary threats while ignoring real dangers, including the manipulator's own harmful behavior. Your world shrinks as you avoid perceived risks, increasing isolation and dependence. Healthy skepticism involves evaluating claims based on evidence rather than emotional manipulation. Seek multiple perspectives, research independently, and remember that legitimate warnings come with actionable solutions, not just demands for blind compliance. Emotional blackmail uses your feelings and relationships as weapons to force compliance. The manipulator threatens to hurt themselves, withdraw love, damage relationships, or create emotional chaos unless you do what they want. This tactic transforms your caring nature into a tool for control. Classic emotional blackmail involves threats like, "I'll hurt myself if you leave me, I'll never speak to you again, I'll tell everyone what you did," or "I'll make sure you never see the children." These threats exploit your fear of loss, guilt, and responsibility for others' well-being. The manipulator often presents these threats as consequences of your actions rather than their own choices. They frame themselves as victims of your decisions, making you feel responsible for their reactions. This shifts blame away from their manipulative behavior onto your reasonable boundaries or choices. Emotional blackmailers are skilled at identifying your pressure points, the relationships, values, or fears that matter most to you. They study your reactions to discover what threats are most effective, then use this knowledge strategically to get what they want. This manipulation creates a no-win situation. Giving in reinforces the behavior and teaches the manipulator that threats work, leading to escalation. Refusing their demands triggers the threatened consequences, causing real pain and stress even when you know you're being manipulated. The constant threat of emotional punishment creates anxiety and hypervigilance. You begin censoring your thoughts, needs, and boundaries to avoid triggering their threats. Your life becomes organized around managing their emotions rather than pursuing your own goals and well-being. Breaking free requires recognizing that you're not responsible for others' choices or reactions. People who truly care about you won't threaten emotional harm to control your behavior. Setting boundaries might trigger temporary chaos, but it's essential for long-term emotional freedom. Playing on insecurities involves identifying and exploiting your deepest fears about yourself, then using those vulnerabilities to control your behavior. Manipulators become experts at discovering what makes you feel inadequate, then strategically triggering those feelings to maintain power over you. The process begins with careful observation and probing questions designed to uncover your sensitive areas. They might notice you're self-conscious about your appearance, worried about your intelligence, or anxious about your worth as a partner or parent. Once identified, these insecurities become tools for manipulation. They might make subtle comments that activate your fears. "Are you sure you want to wear that? I don't think you understood what they meant," or "Other people might think." These statements seem innocent but are precisely designed to trigger your specific anxieties. The manipulator often alternates between attacking and soothing your insecurities. They might criticize your appearance, then offer to help you improve it, question your judgment, then provide guidance, or undermine your confidence, then position themselves as your supporter. This creates dependence on their validation and approval. Over time, your insecurities become so activated that you constantly seek reassurance or avoid situations that might expose your perceived flaws. You might stop socializing, pursuing opportunities, or expressing opinions because you fear confirming the manipulator's subtle criticisms. This tactic is particularly damaging because it uses your own self-doubt against you. The manipulator doesn't need to convince you of anything new, they simply amplify fears you already have, making their influence feel like internal wisdom rather than external manipulation. Recovery involves developing self-compassion and recognizing that everyone has insecurities. Healthy relationships involve people who help you grow stronger, not those who exploit your vulnerabilities for control. Triangulation involves introducing a third party into a two-person conflict or relationship to create competition, jealousy, or insecurity. This manipulation tactic keeps you off balance and focused on winning the manipulator's favor rather than addressing their problematic behavior. The manipulator might compare you unfavorably to others. Sarah would never react like this. My ex understood me better. Or, everyone else thinks you're overreacting. They position themselves as the prize to be won, forcing you to compete for their attention and approval. They often share information selectively, telling you partial truths about what others have said or done to create suspicion and conflict. You might hear that someone criticized you, but the manipulator conveniently positions themselves as your defender while secretly stirring up drama. In family systems, triangulation might involve parents using children to communicate with each other, or playing favorites to maintain control. Workplace manipulators might share confidential information selectively or hint at special relationships with authority figures to create insecurity among colleagues. This tactic serves multiple purposes. It prevents you from forming alliances with others who might support you against the manipulator, keeps you focused on competition rather than their behavior, and maintains their position as the central figure whose approval matters most. The constant comparison and competition is exhausting and degrading. You find yourself trying to prove your worth, defending your value, or working harder to regain favor. Meanwhile, the real issues in the relationship remain unaddressed because you're too busy competing with shadows. Healthy relationships involve direct communication between the people involved. When someone consistently brings third parties into conflicts or makes you feel like you're competing for their attention, they're using triangulation to maintain control rather than building genuine connection. Public shaming involves exposing, embarrassing, or humiliating someone in front of others to enforce compliance and discourage resistance. This manipulation tactic leverages our fundamental need for social acceptance and fear of rejection to control behavior through the threat of reputation damage. The manipulator might criticize you in front of friends, family, or colleagues, share embarrassing personal information, or make jokes at your expense in social settings. They often frame this as humor or honesty, claiming they're just joking or telling the truth when you object. This tactic is particularly effective because humans are social creatures who depend on group acceptance for survival. The fear of social rejection triggers primitive anxiety that can override logical thinking. Even when you know the criticism is unfair, the public nature of the attack feels deeply threatening. The manipulator often chooses moments when you're most vulnerable. Perhaps when you're already stressed, in an unfamiliar environment, or among people whose opinions matter to you. This maximizes the impact and makes resistance more difficult. Public shaming serves multiple functions. It punishes you for unwanted behavior, demonstrates the manipulator's power to others, and creates witnesses who may pressure you to comply to avoid future embarrassment. Other people might encourage you to just go along to keep the peace. The fear of repeat performances can be more controlling than the actual shaming. You begin censoring yourself, avoiding topics that might trigger public criticism, or staying quiet when you would normally speak up. Your behavior becomes organized around avoiding their public disapproval. Recovery involves recognizing that people who truly care about you won't deliberately embarrass you to win arguments or control your behavior. Building confidence in your own worth helps you resist the pressure to comply with unreasonable demands just to avoid public criticism. Hoovering, named after the vacuum cleaner brand, describes the manipulator's attempt to suck you back into a relationship after you've tried to leave or establish boundaries. This tactic involves cycling through various behaviors designed to re-engage your attention and emotional investment. When you start pulling away, the manipulator becomes desperate to regain control. They might suddenly become the person you always wanted them to be: apologetic, romantic, attentive, and promising change. They declare their love, acknowledge their mistakes, and paint a picture of a better future together. If love and promises don't work, they might try guilt and manipulation, reminding you of good times, claiming they'll hurt themselves, or insisting that you're abandoning them in their time of need. They might also try anger and intimidation, threatening consequences if you don't return. Hoovering often involves breadcrumb tactics. Small gestures that keep you emotionally connected without requiring real commitment from them. They might send occasional texts, show up unexpectedly, or reach out through mutual friends to maintain a connection. The manipulator studies your responses to learn which tactics are most effective. If you respond to romantic gestures, they'll use romance. If you respond to emergencies, they'll create crises. Your reactions teach them how to hook you most effectively. This tactic is particularly confusing because it often involves genuine seeming emotion and temporary improvements in behavior. You might think they've finally changed or that you're giving up on someone who truly needs you. However, once you're back under their control, the problematic patterns typically resume. Breaking free requires understanding that hoovering is manipulation, not genuine change. Real change involves consistent behavior over time, respect for your boundaries, and acceptance of your decision to leave. Temporary improvements motivated by fear of losing control are not sustainable transformation. Cognitive dissonance occurs when you hold contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes simultaneously, creating psychological discomfort that manipulators exploit to control your thinking and behavior. They create situations where your direct experience conflicts with your beliefs, making you vulnerable to influence. For example, you might believe your partner loves you, but they consistently treat you poorly. The discomfort of holding these conflicting ideas, they love me versus they hurt me, creates psychological tension that demands resolution. Rather than accepting the painful truth, you might rationalize their behavior or blame yourself. Manipulators deliberately create these contradictions by mixing genuine kindness with harmful behavior, making promises they don't keep, or presenting information that conflicts with your observations. They understand that the human mind seeks consistency and will work hard to resolve contradictions. The resolution often involves changing your perceptions rather than acknowledging the manipulator's problematic behavior. You might minimize abuse, it wasn't that bad, rationalize inconsistencies, they're just stressed, or blame yourself, I must have done something wrong, to restore psychological harmony. This mental gymnastics becomes exhausting over time, but it feels safer than accepting painful truths about people or situations you're invested in. The manipulator encourages these cognitive distortions because they preserve their position while making you doubt your own perceptions. Cults and abusive relationships often exploit cognitive dissonance by creating environments where love and harm coexist, making it difficult for victims to maintain clear thinking about their situation. The constant mental effort required to resolve contradictions leaves little energy for critical thinking or resistance. Healing involves gradually accepting that contradictions can coexist. Someone can claim to love you while treating you poorly, organizations can have noble stated goals while engaging in harmful practices, and your mixed feelings don't invalidate your need for safety and respect. Mirror neurons are brain cells that fire both when you perform an action and when you observe others performing the same action. This neurological system helps us understand others' emotions and intentions, but manipulators can exploit it to influence your mood, behavior, and decision-making without your conscious awareness. Skilled manipulators use body language, facial expressions, and vocal tones strategically to trigger your mirror neuron responses. They might adopt confident postures to make you feel more trusting, use soothing voices to calm your defenses, or mirror your own expressions to create false rapport and connection. This exploitation often involves emotional contagion, the unconscious mimicking of others' emotions. If someone displays calm confidence while lying to you, your mirror neurons might make you feel calmer and more trusting, even when your rational mind detects inconsistencies in their story. Manipulators also use strategic emotional displays to trigger desired responses. They might appear sad to activate your empathy, angry to create fear, or excited to generate enthusiasm for their ideas. Your mirror neurons automatically respond to these displays, influencing your emotional state before you can consciously evaluate the situation. The technique is particularly powerful because it operates below conscious awareness. You might find yourself feeling inexplicably drawn to someone, agreeing with arguments that don't make logical sense, or experiencing emotions that don't match your actual circumstances. In group settings, manipulators might use planted audience members who display desired responses, laughing at jokes, nodding in agreement, or showing enthusiasm. Other people's mirror neurons pick up these cues and begin responding similarly, creating artificial consensus and social pressure. Protecting yourself involves developing awareness of your emotional responses and questioning whether they match the situation. If you feel unusually trusting, afraid, or excited around someone, Pause to consider whether those feelings are appropriate given the circumstances and your actual relationship. Empathy, our ability to understand and share others' feelings, is a fundamental human strength that makes civilization possible. However, manipulators can weaponize this gift, using your compassion against you to gain control, resources, or compliance while avoiding accountability for their own behavior. Empathy exploitation often begins with the manipulator positioning themselves as a victim deserving of your compassion. They share dramatic stories of past trauma, current suffering, or future fears designed to activate your protective instincts. These stories may be exaggerated, fabricated, or strategically timed to serve their agenda. Once your empathy is engaged, the manipulator leverages your desire to help. They might ask for emotional support, financial assistance, or behavior changes that gradually increase your investment in their well-being. Each request seems reasonable given their supposed suffering, making it difficult to refuse without feeling heartless. The manipulation often involves creating a false equivalence between their claimed suffering and your resistance to their demands. If you say no to their requests, they frame it as evidence that you don't care about their pain. This makes setting boundaries feel cruel and selfish. Empathetic people are particularly vulnerable because they naturally prioritize others' needs and assume good intentions. They may ignore red flags, make excuses for problematic behavior, and sacrifice their own well-being to help someone who claims to be suffering. The manipulator may also use your empathy to avoid consequences for their actions. When confronted about harmful behavior, they shift focus to their own pain, making you feel guilty for attacking someone who's already suffering. This deflection prevents accountability and resolution. Protecting your empathy while avoiding exploitation requires learning to distinguish between genuine need and manipulation, setting boundaries around your helping behavior, and remembering that truly caring people don't weaponize your compassion against you. Creating artificial obligation involves making you feel indebted or responsible for the manipulator's well-being, success, or happiness. This tactic transforms normal relationship dynamics into one-sided arrangements where you owe them something, justifying their demands and controlling behavior. The manipulator might emphasize past favors, gifts, or support they've provided, constantly reminding you of their generosity. They create a mental ledger where you're always in debt, owing them gratitude, loyalty, or compliance. Phrases like, "After everything I've done for you," or "You owe me this much" become common refrains. They might also manufacture obligations through guilt and responsibility. They position themselves as helpless or vulnerable, making you feel responsible for their emotional state, financial security, or physical well-being. Your natural desire to help becomes twisted into an expectation that you'll sacrifice your own needs for theirs. This manipulation often involves exaggerating their contributions while minimizing yours. They present themselves as having made enormous sacrifices while treating your efforts as insignificant or expected. This creates an imbalanced perception where you feel constantly indebted despite giving considerably. False emergencies and crises are another common tactic. The manipulator creates urgent situations where you feel obligated to help, then uses these instances to establish patterns of availability and sacrifice. Each emergency becomes evidence of your obligation to prioritize their needs. The sense of obligation becomes so strong that you feel guilty for having your own needs, pursuing your own goals, or spending time on activities that don't benefit them. Your life becomes organized around fulfilling what feels like legitimate debt but is actually manufactured control. Healthy relationships involve mutual give and take without keeping score. People who constantly remind you of what you owe them, make you feel guilty for having boundaries, or frame your independence as ingratitude are exploiting your sense of fairness rather than building genuine connection. Divide and conquer involves systematically breaking up alliances, friendships, and support networks that might threaten the manipulator's control. By isolating you from potential allies and creating conflict between people who might support you, they ensure they remain your primary source of information, validation, and guidance. The manipulator identifies your strongest relationships and most supportive connections, then works to undermine them. They might share selective information designed to create misunderstandings, reveal confidences that damage trust, or create situations where your allies appear unreliable or unsupportive. They often present themselves as your protector against others' supposed betrayals or criticisms. They might claim that your friends don't really care about you, your family doesn't understand you, or your colleagues are plotting against you. This positions them as your only true ally while everyone else becomes a potential threat. The tactic includes preventing coalition building by controlling information flow. They might share different stories with different people, ensuring that no one has the complete picture needed to recognize the manipulation. They also discourage communication between potential allies by creating scheduling conflicts or social tensions. In family systems, this might involve playing family members against each other, sharing secrets selectively to create drama, or positioning themselves as the central figure whose approval everyone seeks. In workplace settings, they might spread rumors, take credit for others' work, or create competitive dynamics that prevent collaboration. The isolation gradually becomes complete as relationships are damaged and support networks collapse. You find yourself increasingly dependent on the manipulator's perspective and guidance because you no longer have trusted friends or family members to provide reality checks or alternative viewpoints. Recognizing divide and conquer tactics involves noticing patterns where your relationships consistently deteriorate after the manipulator's involvement, where you receive conflicting information about people's attitudes toward you, or where you feel increasingly isolated from former sources of support. Authority bias is our tendency to attribute greater accuracy and importance to the opinions and directives of perceived authority figures. Manipulators exploit this cognitive bias by positioning themselves as experts, leaders, or individuals with special knowledge, making their influence feel legitimate and their demands reasonable. The manipulator might claim professional credentials, special training, or insider knowledge that supposedly makes them more qualified to make decisions or provide guidance. They present themselves as doctors, lawyers, spiritual leaders, or experts in fields relevant to your concerns even when their credentials are fabricated or irrelevant. They often use authoritative language and behaviors, speaking with confidence, using technical terminology, displaying symbols of status or education, or name-dropping connections to legitimate authorities. These displays create an aura of competence and reliability that makes questioning them feel disrespectful or ignorant. The manipulation becomes more powerful when combined with social proof. The manipulator might surround themselves with others who treat them as an authority, creating a consensus that reinforces their claimed expertise. Testimonials, awards, or recognition from other apparent authorities add credibility to their position. This bias is particularly dangerous because it bypasses critical thinking. When someone appears to be an authority, we tend to accept their statements without the same level of scrutiny we'd apply to peers. We assume they have access to information or expertise that justifies their conclusions. Manipulators also exploit situational authority by positioning themselves as the person in charge during crises or unfamiliar situations. They might take control during emergencies, claim special knowledge about complex topics, or present themselves as the only person capable of solving particular problems. Protecting yourself involves remembering that legitimate authorities welcome questions, provide evidence for their claims, and respect your autonomy. Be suspicious of anyone who demands unquestioning obedience, refuses to explain their reasoning, or claims that questioning them is dangerous or disrespectful. Scapegoating represents one of humanity's oldest psychological manipulation tactics, where an individual or group is unfairly blamed for problems they didn't create. This technique exploits our fundamental need to find simple explanations for complex situations. When people feel frustrated, anxious, or powerless, manipulators redirect these emotions toward convenient targets. The process begins with identifying vulnerabilities in both the audience and potential scapegoats. Manipulators carefully select targets who are different, isolated, or unable to defend themselves effectively. They then construct narratives that paint these targets as the root cause of widespread problems, offering their audience someone to blame and hate. This technique is particularly dangerous because it provides psychological relief through false certainty. Instead of grappling with nuanced, multifaceted issues, people can focus their anger on a single source. Historical examples include the targeting of minority groups during economic downturns, political opponents during crises, or employees during corporate failures. Scapegoating works by triggering our tribal instincts and need for belonging. By joining in the blame, individuals feel part of an in-group while simultaneously distancing themselves from responsibility. The manipulator benefits by deflecting attention from their own failures while consolidating power through shared hostility. Recognizing scapegoating requires questioning oversimplified explanations and examining whether blame is proportionate and evidence-based. Ask yourself, is this explanation too convenient? Does it serve someone's interests? Are we being encouraged to stop thinking critically about complex issues? Social proof exploitation weaponizes our natural tendency to look to others for behavioral guidance, particularly in uncertain situations. This powerful psychological principle suggests that people determine appropriate behavior by observing what others do, making it a prime target for manipulation. Manipulators artificially create or exaggerate social proof to influence decisions. They might fabricate testimonials, inflate popularity metrics, or stage enthusiastic crowds to suggest widespread approval. Online, this manifests through fake reviews, bot-generated likes, or coordinated social media campaigns designed to create the illusion of organic support. The technique becomes particularly potent when combined with uncertainty and time pressure. When people feel unsure about a decision, they rely more heavily on social cues. Manipulators exploit this by presenting carefully curated evidence of others' choices while hiding contrary information. Sophisticated operators understand that social proof varies in effectiveness based on similarity and perceived expertise. They'll showcase testimonials from people who closely match their target audience's demographics, values, or circumstances. The message becomes, "People just like you have already made this choice successfully." The danger lies in the artificial nature of the presented proof. Real social proof reflects genuine collective wisdom and experience. Manipulated social proof leads people toward decisions that may not serve their interests, based on fabricated consensus. Protection requires developing healthy skepticism about popularity claims. Ask for verifiable evidence, seek out dissenting opinions, and remember that widespread acceptance doesn't guarantee correctness. The most important question is whether the choice serves your genuine needs, regardless of what others appear to be doing. Groupthink induction deliberately creates conditions that suppress critical thinking and dissent within groups. This manipulation technique transforms natural group dynamics into a tool for control, making individuals more compliant and less likely to question leadership or group decisions. The process begins by fostering an illusion of unanimity and invulnerability. Manipulators encourage the belief that the group is special, morally superior, and incapable of serious errors. They create echo chambers where dissenting voices are marginalized or eliminated entirely, making opposition seem unthinkable. Key elements include establishing unquestioned leadership, creating us versus them mentalities, and implementing social pressure to conform. Members learn that questioning group decisions leads to isolation, criticism, or exclusion. This creates a psychological environment where conformity becomes the path of least resistance. The technique exploits our fundamental need for belonging and acceptance. Humans are social creatures who derive identity and security from group membership. When manipulators make group acceptance conditional on unquestioning loyalty, they tap into these deep psychological needs. Groupthink becomes particularly dangerous when combined with isolation from outside perspectives. Manipulators often encourage members to limit contact with outsiders, consume only group-approved information, or view external criticism as evidence of persecution. Symptoms include rapid consensus without genuine discussion, suppression of dissenting opinions, and belief in group moral superiority. Protection requires maintaining connections to diverse perspectives, cultivating comfort with uncertainty, and remembering that healthy groups encourage respectful disagreement. The strongest groups are those that can examine their own assumptions and adapt when necessary. Cultivating false identity involves manipulators systematically reshaping how individuals see themselves, often replacing authentic self-perception with a manufactured identity that serves the manipulator's purposes. This technique attacks the very core of personal autonomy by altering the foundational beliefs people hold about who they are. The process typically begins with identity disruption, where manipulators identify and attack existing self-concepts that might resist their influence. They might criticize past accomplishments, question personal values, or undermine confidence in individual judgment. This creates psychological instability and openness to new identity frameworks. Next comes identity reconstruction, where manipulators offer a new sense of self that appears more appealing, special, or meaningful than the previous identity. This new identity often comes with rigid rules about appropriate thoughts, behaviors, and associations. The individual learns that maintaining their new identity requires constant vigilance and adherence to external standards. This technique is particularly insidious because it makes resistance feel like self-betrayal. When someone's identity becomes tied to a manipulator's goals, questioning those goals feels like questioning their own worth and authenticity. The manipulator has successfully outsourced the individual's internal control mechanisms. False identity cultivation often involves creating artificial scarcity around identity validation. The manipulator becomes the primary source of confirmation that the individual is living up to their true self, creating dependency and vulnerability to further manipulation. Recovery requires reconnecting with authentic values and desires that existed before manipulation began. This often involves examining which beliefs feel genuinely personal versus those that were imposed by others. True identity emerges from internal reflection and genuine choice, not external validation or control. Planting seeds of self-doubt represents a foundational manipulation strategy where manipulators systematically undermine their target's confidence in their own perceptions, memories, and judgment. This technique creates psychological dependence by making individuals question their ability to navigate reality independently. The process often begins subtly, with manipulators questioning minor details or providing slightly different versions of events. They might suggest that the target misremembered conversations, misunderstood situations, or overreacted to circumstances. These small discrepancies accumulate over time, creating a pattern of uncertainty about personal reliability. Advanced practitioners use intermittent reinforcement, sometimes validating the target's perceptions while other times questioning them. This unpredictability prevents adaptation and maintains a constant state of uncertainty. The target never knows when their judgment will be confirmed or challenged, leading to chronic self-monitoring and second-guessing. The technique becomes particularly effective when manipulators present themselves as more reliable sources of truth. They position themselves as having better memory, clearer judgment, or superior understanding of situations. This creates a dynamic where the target increasingly relies on the manipulator's version of reality. Self-doubt manipulation often exploits existing insecurities or past mistakes. Manipulators identify areas where individuals already feel uncertain and amplify these feelings. They might reference previous errors as evidence of ongoing unreliability, creating a narrative of personal inadequacy. Protection requires developing trust in your own experiences and maintaining external reality checks through trusted friends or documentation. Keep records of important conversations and decisions. Remember that healthy relationships involve mutual respect for each person's perceptions and experiences, not constant questioning of your basic competence. Emotional contagion exploitation manipulates the natural human tendency to unconsciously mirror and absorb the emotions of others. This technique weaponizes our empathetic responses and social bonding mechanisms to create desired emotional states that serve the manipulator's agenda. The phenomenon occurs through multiple channels: facial expressions, body language, vocal tone, and energy levels. Skilled manipulators deliberately cultivate and project specific emotions designed to trigger corresponding responses in their targets. They might display artificial enthusiasm to generate excitement, fake urgency to create anxiety, or perform vulnerability to elicit protective responses. This technique becomes particularly powerful in group settings where emotional contagion can cascade through multiple people simultaneously. A manipulator might seed strong emotions in a few key individuals, knowing these emotions will spread throughout the group organically. This creates the illusion that the emotional response is natural and widespread rather than artificially induced. Digital manipulation amplifies this effect through carefully crafted content designed to trigger specific emotional responses. Social media posts, videos, and images are engineered to generate anger, fear, joy, or outrage that then spreads through networks of connected individuals. The danger lies in the artificial nature of the induced emotions. Instead of responding to genuine circumstances, people make decisions based on manipulated emotional states that may not reflect reality or serve their interests. This can lead to impulsive actions, poor judgment, and regret once the emotional manipulation ends. Protection requires developing emotional awareness and regulation skills. Practice identifying your emotional state and questioning whether it matches the actual circumstances. Create space between feeling and action, allowing time for reflection before making important decisions based on strong emotions. The illusion of choice manipulation creates the appearance of freedom and autonomy while actually constraining options to serve the manipulator's predetermined outcomes. This technique is particularly insidious because it makes targets feel empowered while being guided toward specific decisions. The process involves carefully curating available options to ensure that all paths lead to acceptable outcomes for the manipulator. They might present 3 choices, all of which serve their interests, while omitting genuinely alternative options. This creates the psychological satisfaction of making a decision while eliminating actual agency. Sophisticated practitioners use anchoring to make certain options appear more attractive. They might present an extremely unfavorable choice alongside their preferred option, making the latter seem reasonable by comparison. Or they might structure choices to appear as compromises, making targets feel they're finding middle ground when they're actually accepting predetermined outcomes. The technique often involves false dichotomies, where complex situations are reduced to binary choices that ignore numerous other possibilities. This forces targets to operate within the manipulator's framework rather than considering the full range of available options. Time pressure frequently accompanies this manipulation, creating urgency that prevents careful consideration of alternatives. Targets are encouraged to choose quickly from the presented options rather than step back and evaluate whether the choices truly serve their interests. Protection requires expanding your decision-making process beyond presented options. Ask what choices aren't being offered, seek additional alternatives, and consider whether the decision framework itself serves your interests. Remember that you often have the option to delay decisions, seek more information, or reject the entire premise of the choice as presented. Anchoring effect manipulation exploits the cognitive bias where people rely heavily on the first piece of information encountered when making decisions. Manipulators strategically present initial information that skews all subsequent judgments in their favor even when that information is irrelevant or inaccurate. The technique works by establishing a reference point that becomes the mental anchor for all comparisons. In negotiations, a manipulator might start with an extremely high or low offer, knowing that all subsequent offers will be evaluated relative to this initial anchor. Even when people recognize the anchor as unreasonable, it continues to influence their perception of what constitutes a fair deal. Anchoring becomes particularly powerful when combined with apparent expertise or authority. When manipulators present themselves as knowledgeable sources, their initial statements carry more weight and create stronger anchors. People assume that expert opinions represent reasonable starting points for evaluation. The effect persists even when people are aware of the manipulation attempt. Research shows that explicitly telling people about anchoring bias only slightly reduces its influence. The initial information continues to shape judgment unconsciously even when conscious awareness recognizes the manipulation. Digital environments amplify anchoring through carefully crafted first impressions, initial prices, or opening statements that frame entire interactions. Social media algorithms may present information in sequences designed to create specific anchors that influence subsequent content interpretation. Protection requires conscious effort to establish independent reference points before exposure to potential anchors. Research typical ranges for prices, outcomes, or values in relevant contexts. When possible, generate your own initial estimates before hearing others' positions. Most importantly, remember that first information isn't necessarily accurate information regardless of how it's presented. Framing effect manipulation involves presenting identical information in different ways to influence how people perceive and respond to that information. This technique exploits the fact that human decision-making is heavily influenced by context and presentation even when the underlying facts remain unchanged. The manipulation works by emphasizing certain aspects of information while de-emphasizing others. A manipulator might present a medical treatment as 90% effective rather than fails 10% of the time, even though both statements convey identical information. The positive framing makes the treatment appear more attractive and increases acceptance rates. Loss versus gain framing represents a particularly powerful variant. People typically respond more strongly to potential losses than equivalent gains, so manipulators might emphasize what targets stand to lose by not acting rather than what they might gain by acting. This creates urgency and motivation that serves the manipulator's goals. Temporal framing manipulates time perception by presenting information in terms of immediate versus distant consequences. Manipulators might emphasize short-term benefits while downplaying long-term costs, or vice versa, depending on their objectives. This exploits natural human tendencies to discount future consequences in favor of immediate rewards. Statistical framing involves presenting numbers in ways that support desired conclusions. Percentages, absolute numbers, and relative comparisons can all convey the same information while creating very different impressions. Manipulators choose the presentation format that best supports their agenda. Protection requires developing multiple perspective-taking skills. When presented with information, consciously reframe it in different ways. Ask how the same facts might be presented by someone with opposing interests. Look for missing context or alternative interpretations that might change your understanding of the situation. Confirmation bias reinforcement exploits the natural human tendency to seek information that confirms existing beliefs while avoiding information that challenges them. Manipulators create environments that continuously validate their target's preconceptions, making alternative viewpoints seem wrong or irrelevant. The technique begins with identifying the target's existing beliefs, preferences, and biases. Manipulators then provide a steady stream of information that appears to confirm these beliefs while carefully filtering out contradictory evidence. This creates the illusion that the target's worldview is not only correct but obviously true to any reasonable person. Sophisticated operators understand that confirmation bias is strongest when people feel their identity or values are threatened. They present information in ways that make acceptance feel like defending personal beliefs rather than simply evaluating facts. This transforms information processing from analytical thinking into identity protection. The manipulation often involves creating custom information ecosystems where targets primarily encounter confirming evidence. This might involve curated social media feeds, selective news sources, or social groups that share similar perspectives. The target gradually loses contact with dissenting viewpoints and begins to see their particular bubble as representative of broader reality. Echo chambers amplify this effect by surrounding targets with others who share similar biases. Confirmation bias becomes social proof, where the shared beliefs of the group appear to validate individual perspectives. This makes questioning group beliefs feel like questioning the judgment of trusted peers. Protection requires actively seeking out disagreement and diverse perspectives. Deliberately expose yourself to high-quality information sources that challenge your assumptions. Practice steelmanning opposing arguments by trying to understand them at their strongest rather than their weakest. Remember that comfort with information often indicates confirmation bias rather than truth. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, occurs when something recently noticed appears to show up everywhere with unusual frequency. Manipulators exploit this cognitive bias by strategically introducing concepts, products, or ideas that then seem to appear repeatedly in the target's environment, creating the illusion of significance or destiny. The manipulation works through coordinated exposure across multiple channels. After introducing an idea or product, manipulators ensure it appears in various contexts that seem unrelated. This might involve social media campaigns, planted conversations, or synchronized messaging across different platforms. The target begins noticing these appearances and interprets the frequency as meaningful rather than manufactured. The technique exploits our pattern-seeking nature and desire to find meaning in coincidence. When people encounter repeated references to something they've recently learned about, they often interpret this as evidence of its importance or relevance to their lives. This creates openness to further influence and makes subsequent manipulation more effective. Digital environments make this manipulation particularly easy to execute. Algorithms can ensure that certain content appears regularly in someone's feed, while data tracking allows manipulators to coordinate exposure across multiple platforms. The target experiences what feels like organic coincidence but is actually carefully orchestrated repetition. The phenomenon becomes more powerful when combined with personal relevance. Manipulators might introduce concepts during emotionally significant moments or in contexts that feel personally meaningful. This creates stronger memory formation and increases the likelihood that subsequent exposures will be noticed and interpreted as significant. Protection requires recognizing that frequency doesn't necessarily indicate importance. When you notice something appearing repeatedly, consider whether this could be the result of increased attention rather than increased occurrence. Ask whether the pattern serves someone's interests and whether your perception of frequency matches objective reality. Mirror and matching involves manipulators subtly copying their target's behavior, communication style, beliefs, or preferences to create artificial rapport and trust. This technique exploits the natural human tendency to feel more comfortable with people who seem similar to us, making targets more susceptible to influence and manipulation. The process begins with careful observation of the target's verbal and nonverbal communication patterns. Manipulators note speech tempo, vocabulary choices, body language, and energy levels. They then gradually adjust their own behavior to match these patterns, creating the subconscious impression of similarity and compatibility. Advanced practitioners extend mirroring beyond immediate behavior to include values, interests, and life experiences. They might claim to share the target's background, struggles, or aspirations, creating deeper emotional connections. This false intimacy makes targets more likely to trust the manipulator's judgment and follow their recommendations. The technique works by triggering unconscious social bonding mechanisms. Humans naturally feel more comfortable with people who seem similar to them, interpreting this similarity as evidence of trustworthiness and shared interests. Manipulators exploit this by creating artificial similarity that serves their purposes rather than reflecting genuine connection. Mirroring can be particularly effective when combined with gradual leading, where manipulators slowly shift their behavior toward desired outcomes while maintaining the appearance of similarity. Targets follow along without realizing they're being guided away from their original positions. Digital manipulation uses data analysis to identify personal characteristics that can be mirrored through customized content, messaging, or interaction styles. Automated systems can adjust communication patterns to match individual preferences, creating personalized manipulation at scale. Protection requires developing awareness of your own patterns and noticing when others seem to match them too perfectly. Be suspicious of people who claim to share numerous similarities with you, especially if these similarities emerge conveniently during influence attempts. Pacing and leading represents a sophisticated manipulation technique where manipulators first establish rapport by matching the target's current state, pacing, then gradually guide them toward desired thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, leading. This creates the illusion that changes are natural and self-generated rather than externally imposed. The pacing phase involves demonstrating understanding and acceptance of the target's current situation, emotions, or perspectives. Manipulators might acknowledge legitimate concerns, validate feelings, or agree with obviously true statements. This creates trust and makes the target feel understood and supported. Once rapport is established, manipulators begin subtle leading by gradually introducing new ideas, questions, or perspectives. They might start with minor suggestions that align with the target's existing beliefs, then slowly expand toward more significant changes. The key is maintaining the feeling of agreement and natural progression. The technique becomes particularly powerful when manipulators alternate between pacing and leading throughout an interaction. They might pace resistance by acknowledging concerns, then lead by offering solutions. This creates a rhythm of understanding and guidance that feels supportive rather than controlling. Skilled practitioners use embedded commands and presuppositions during the leading phase. They might say when you decide to make this change rather than if you decide, subtly assuming that change is inevitable. These linguistic patterns guide thinking without triggering conscious resistance. The manipulation works because it respects the target's autonomy while subtly directing it. People feel they're making their own decisions because the manipulator has skillfully guided them through a process that feels natural and self-directed. Protection requires recognizing when someone seems to understand you unusually well, especially if this understanding coincides with attempts to influence your decisions. Be cautious of people who validate your concerns while simultaneously guiding you toward specific outcomes. Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP manipulation employs specific language patterns and techniques designed to influence unconscious thought processes and behavior. While NLP has legitimate therapeutic applications, manipulators use these techniques to bypass critical thinking and create compliance without conscious awareness. The approach focuses on the connection between language, thought, and behavior. Manipulators use specific words, phrases, and sentence structures designed to trigger particular mental states or responses. They might use presuppositions that assume certain facts are true or employ embedded commands that suggest actions without direct requests. Anchoring represents a key NLP technique where manipulators associate specific stimuli with desired emotional states. They might touch someone's shoulder while discussing positive topics, creating an unconscious association between the touch and positive feelings. Later, the same touch can trigger those positive emotions, making the target more receptive to influence. Reframing involves changing the meaning or context of situations to alter how people perceive them. A manipulator might reframe resistance as fear, problems as opportunities or criticism as jealousy. This linguistic manipulation changes emotional responses without changing underlying facts. Rapport building through language involves matching the target's preferred communication style. Some people respond better to visual language, "I see what you mean," others to auditory, "That sounds right," or kinesthetic, "I feel that's correct." Manipulators adjust their language to match these preferences, creating unconscious comfort and trust. The danger lies in the subtle nature of these techniques. Targets often don't realize they're being influenced because the manipulation occurs below conscious awareness. Changes in thinking or behavior feel natural and self-generated rather than externally imposed. Protection requires developing awareness of language patterns and their effects on your thinking. Notice when someone's communication style seems unusually effective at changing your mood or perspective. Subliminal messaging involves presenting information below the threshold of conscious awareness designed to influence behavior or attitudes without the target's knowledge. While the effectiveness of traditional subliminal advertising is debated, manipulators use various forms of unconscious influence that operate below conscious detection. Modern subliminal techniques include rapid visual presentations, embedded images, or audio messages masked by other sounds. Digital environments enable more sophisticated approaches such as barely visible text, micro-expressions in video content, or brief flashes of images designed to influence mood or associations. The technique works by exploiting the gap between conscious and unconscious processing. The brain processes far more information than reaches conscious awareness, and manipulators attempt to insert messages into this unconscious processing stream. Even if consciously undetected, these messages might influence mood, associations, or behavioral tendencies. Priming represents a related technique where exposure to certain stimuli influences subsequent responses to related stimuli. Manipulators might prime aggressive thoughts through violent imagery or prime consumption desires through luxury imagery, creating behavioral tendencies that feel spontaneous rather than influenced. Environmental manipulation uses subliminal cues embedded in physical or digital spaces. This might include specific colors, sounds, or scents designed to influence mood and behavior. Retail environments often employ these techniques to encourage spending, while digital interfaces might use subtle visual cues to guide attention and behavior. The ethical concern lies in the attempt to influence without consent or awareness. Even if the effects are minimal, the intent to manipulate unconscious processes raises questions about autonomy and informed consent. Protection requires general awareness that your environment constantly influences your mental state. While you can't consciously detect all subliminal influences, you can maintain awareness that your thoughts and feelings may be influenced by factors beyond your conscious recognition. Priming effect manipulation involves exposing targets to specific stimuli that unconsciously influence their subsequent thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. This technique exploits the fact that recent experiences shape how we interpret and respond to new information even when we're unaware of the connection. The process works through associative networks in memory. When certain concepts are activated through priming, related concepts become more accessible and influential in subsequent thinking. A manipulator might prime aggressive thoughts through violent imagery, making targets more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening or respond more aggressively to conflicts. Semantic priming uses words or concepts to influence interpretation of later information. Exposing someone to words related to elderly people might make them walk more slowly afterward, even though they're unaware of the connection. Manipulators use this to create desired mental states before important interactions or decisions. Environmental priming involves surrounding targets with stimuli that promote specific mindsets. This might include particular colors, sounds, imagery, or physical arrangements designed to influence mood and behavior. Retail environments often use priming to encourage spending, while workplaces might use it to promote productivity or compliance. Social priming involves exposure to information about social groups or stereotypes that influences subsequent judgments and behaviors. Manipulators might prime racial, gender, or cultural stereotypes to influence how targets perceive and interact with members of these groups. The technique is particularly insidious because the influence feels natural and self-generated. Targets experience changed thoughts or behaviors as their own authentic responses rather than the result of external manipulation. Protection requires awareness that your mental state is influenced by recent experiences and environmental factors. When making important decisions, consider whether your current environment or recent exposures might be influencing your judgment in ways that don't serve your interests. Suggestive language and hypnotic techniques in manipulation involve using specific communication patterns designed to bypass critical thinking and create compliance. While clinical hypnosis is a legitimate therapeutic tool, manipulators use similar techniques to influence behavior without explicit consent or awareness. The approach relies on altered states of consciousness where critical thinking is reduced and suggestibility is increased. Manipulators might use relaxation techniques, repetitive language patterns, or focused attention to create these states. Once established, suggestions become more likely to be accepted without question. Conversational hypnosis involves embedding hypnotic techniques within normal conversation. This might include using specific tonalities, speaking rhythms, or language patterns that induce trance-like states. The target remains conscious but becomes more receptive to suggestions and less likely to critically evaluate information. Confusion techniques deliberately overwhelm conscious thinking to create openness to suggestion. Manipulators might present complex, contradictory, or rapidly changing information that exhausts analytical thinking. In this confused state, simple suggestions become more appealing and likely to be accepted. Authority and credibility enhancement makes suggestions more powerful by establishing the manipulator as a trustworthy expert. This might involve displaying credentials, using technical language, or claiming special knowledge that supports their suggestions. Progressive relaxation and focus techniques gradually shift attention away from external awareness toward internal states. This creates the focused attention necessary for suggestibility while making the process feel natural and voluntary. The danger lies in the reduced critical thinking and increased compliance that these techniques can create. Targets might accept suggestions they would normally reject or make decisions that don't serve their interests. Protection requires maintaining awareness of your mental state during interactions and recognizing when someone seems to be deliberately altering your consciousness or critical thinking abilities. Creating artificial urgency represents a manipulation technique where manipulators impose false time constraints to pressure targets into quick decisions that bypass careful consideration. This technique exploits our instinctive responses to time pressure and potential loss, making us more likely to act without thorough evaluation. The manipulation works by triggering stress responses that narrow attention and reduce analytical thinking. When people feel pressed for time, they rely more heavily on mental shortcuts and emotional responses rather than careful analysis. Manipulators exploit this by creating deadline pressure that serves their interests rather than reflecting genuine constraints. Scarcity messaging often accompanies urgency, suggesting that opportunities are limited and may disappear if not acted upon immediately. Phrases like, limited time offer, only a few left, or this deal expires soon, create psychological pressure to act quickly before the opportunity vanishes. Social proof amplifies urgency by suggesting that others are acting quickly and the target risks being left behind. Manipulators might claim that demand is high, that others are making similar decisions, or that delay means missing out on what everyone else is obtaining. The technique becomes particularly effective when combined with loss aversion, where manipulators emphasize what the target stands to lose by delaying rather than what they might gain by acting. This exploits the psychological principle that people feel losses more strongly than equivalent gains. Digital environments enable sophisticated urgency manipulation through countdown timers, inventory warnings, or notifications about others' actions. These create the appearance of external pressure while actually representing manufactured urgency designed to drive specific behaviors. Protection requires questioning the source and validity of time pressure. Ask whether the urgency serves your interests or someone else's and whether the claimed time constraints are genuine or artificial. Remember that most good opportunities allow time for careful consideration. The foot-in-the-door technique involves manipulators securing compliance with small, seemingly reasonable requests to establish a pattern of agreement that makes larger requests more likely to be accepted. This technique exploits the human tendency toward consistency and the desire to maintain a coherent self-image. The process begins with requests that are easy to fulfill and appear harmless or beneficial. These might involve signing a petition, answering a brief survey, or accepting a small favor. The key is choosing initial requests that most people would agree to without feeling manipulated or pressured. Once compliance is established, manipulators gradually escalate their requests. They might reference the previous agreement as evidence of the target's commitment to the underlying cause or principle. This creates psychological pressure to remain consistent with past behavior even as requests become more demanding. The technique works by exploiting commitment and consistency principles. People prefer to see themselves as consistent and reliable, so once they've agreed to support something, they feel psychological pressure to continue that support. Refusing later requests feels like admitting they were wrong or insincere in their initial agreement. Self-perception plays a crucial role in this manipulation. When people comply with initial requests, they may begin to see themselves as the type of person who supports the cause or helps others. This identity shift makes subsequent requests feel more aligned with their self-concept. The escalation often happens slowly enough that targets don't notice the increasing demands. Each request feels like a natural extension of previous agreements rather than a significant escalation of commitment. Protection requires recognizing when someone seems to be establishing a pattern of compliance and questioning whether each request truly serves your interests. Be willing to change your mind about commitments when circumstances or information change, regardless of previous agreements. The door-in-the-face technique involves manipulators making an initial request that is so large or unreasonable that it's almost certain to be rejected, followed by a smaller request that appears reasonable by comparison. This technique exploits reciprocity principles and contrast effects to increase compliance with the true objective. The process begins with an extreme request that exceeds what most people would consider reasonable. This might involve asking for a large donation, significant time commitment, or major favor. The manipulator expects this request to be refused but uses it to set up the contrast for their real objective. After the initial refusal, manipulators present their actual request, which appears much more reasonable in comparison to the extreme initial demand. This creates the illusion that they're compromising or being flexible, when in fact the second request was their goal from the beginning. The technique works through several psychological mechanisms. Reciprocity suggests that when someone makes a concession by reducing their request, we feel obligated to reciprocate with a concession of our own by agreeing to the smaller request. This feels like finding middle ground rather than being manipulated. Contrast effects make the second request appear more reasonable than it would have presented in isolation. Our judgment is influenced by the extreme initial request, making moderate demands seem small and manageable by comparison. Guilt and social pressure often accompany this technique. Targets may feel guilty about refusing the initial request, making them more likely to agree to the second request as a way of demonstrating their reasonableness or helpfulness. The manipulation is particularly effective because it creates the illusion of negotiation and compromise. Targets feel they've reached a fair agreement when they've actually been guided toward the manipulator's predetermined objective. Protection requires recognizing when initial requests seem designed to be refused and evaluating subsequent requests on their own merits rather than in comparison to extreme alternatives. Low-balling manipulation involves manipulators initially offering attractive terms to secure agreement, then gradually revealing additional costs, requirements, or less favorable conditions after commitment has been established. This technique exploits commitment and consistency principles to maintain compliance even as the deal becomes less attractive. The process begins with an offer that appears significantly better than alternatives. This might involve lower prices, fewer requirements, or more favorable terms than competitors provide. The manipulator secures initial agreement or commitment based on these attractive conditions. Once commitment is established, manipulators begin revealing additional information that makes the deal less attractive. They might discover unexpected costs, identify required upgrades, or impose standard fees that weren't mentioned initially. Each revelation is presented as a minor adjustment rather than a significant change. The technique works because people want to maintain consistency with their previous commitments. Once someone has agreed to a deal, they feel psychological pressure to follow through even as conditions become less favorable. Backing out feels like admitting they made a poor decision or were easily fooled. Sunk cost fallacy amplifies this effect. As people invest time, energy, or emotion into a process, they become increasingly reluctant to abandon it even when circumstances change. The manipulator leverages this by making the initial commitment process feel significant and meaningful. Social factors often support low-balling as people may feel embarrassed about changing their minds or concerned about appearing indecisive. Manipulators might reference the time and effort already invested or suggest that backing out would be unfair or unreasonable. Protection requires maintaining willingness to reconsider commitments when circumstances change significantly. Remember that agreements based on incomplete or inaccurate information are not binding, and that protecting your interests is more important than appearing consistent. The bandwagon effect is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior. When we see others doing something, our brains automatically assume it must be the right choice. This isn't just about peer pressure, it's a deep psychological mechanism that helped our ancestors survive by following the crowd to safety. Marketers exploit this constantly. Join millions of satisfied customers. Our best-selling product. Most popular choice. These phrases trigger our instinct to follow the majority. Social media amplifies this effect exponentially. When we see likes, shares, and comments, we're more likely to engage because others already have. The bandwagon effect works because it reduces cognitive load. Instead of researching every decision, we take mental shortcuts by copying what others do. This can be helpful. Following traffic patterns or restaurant recommendations often works well, but it becomes manipulation when artificial social proof is created. Companies use fake reviews, inflated user numbers, and paid testimonials to create false bandwagons. They know that once momentum starts, real people will jump on. Political campaigns use this too, showing poll numbers and crowd sizes to suggest inevitability. The key to resistance is awareness. Ask yourself, am I choosing this because it's genuinely good for me or because others are doing it? Sometimes following the crowd is smart, but your decisions should be conscious choices, not automatic responses to manufactured social pressure. Remember, popularity doesn't equal quality, and the majority isn't always right. Scarcity is the ultimate motivator. When something becomes rare or limited, our brains perceive it as more valuable even when nothing about the item itself has changed. This psychological quirk evolved because truly scarce resources like food or shelter were matters of survival. Today, that same urgency gets triggered by limited-time offers. The scarcity effect works through multiple psychological mechanisms. First, it creates urgency by adding time pressure. Second, it enhances perceived value. We assume rare things must be better. Third, it triggers loss aversion, making us fear missing out more than we desire gaining something. Retailers master artificial scarcity. Only 3 left in stock. Sale ends tonight. Limited edition. These tactics create immediate emotional responses that override rational thinking. Online shopping sites show other customers viewing the same item, suggesting competition for limited resources. The psychology runs deeper than simple marketing tricks. Scarcity also plays on our need for uniqueness and status. Owning something rare makes us feel special and distinguished from others. This is why luxury brands deliberately limit production and why exclusive memberships are so appealing. Real scarcity exists, but manufactured scarcity is manipulation. Before making urgent decisions, pause and ask, is this genuinely scarce, or am I being pressured? Often, the opportunity will still exist tomorrow. If not, consider whether you really needed it anyway. True value doesn't depend on artificial limitations. Make decisions based on merit, not manufactured urgency. Humans have an overwhelming psychological need for closure, the desire to resolve uncertainty and reach definitive conclusions. This drive helped our ancestors make quick survival decisions, but today it's exploited to manipulate our choices and behaviors. We're so uncomfortable with ambiguity that we'll often accept any answer rather than tolerate uncertainty. The need for closure manifests in various ways. We hate unfinished stories, which is why cliffhangers are so effective. We prefer simple explanations over complex ones, even when reality is nuanced. We rush to judgment rather than sit with uncomfortable unknowns. This makes us vulnerable to manipulation by those who offer quick, easy answers. Politicians exploit this by providing simple solutions to complex problems. The cause of your struggles is this group of people. This single policy will fix everything. These oversimplified narratives satisfy our need for closure while avoiding the messy reality of interconnected issues. Marketers use similar tactics. This product will solve all your problems. Follow these 3 simple steps. They know we prefer neat, complete solutions over acknowledging that most improvements require ongoing effort and multiple approaches. The manipulation becomes dangerous when we accept false closure over no closure. It's better to admit uncertainty than to embrace comforting lies. Critical thinking requires tolerating ambiguity and complexity. When someone offers you a simple explanation for a complex problem, be suspicious. Real understanding often comes with acknowledging what we don't know. Micro-manipulation operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, using tiny, seemingly insignificant actions to influence behavior. These subtle techniques are particularly insidious because they feel natural and unforced, making targets believe they're making independent choices while being carefully guided toward predetermined outcomes. Unlike obvious manipulation tactics, micro-manipulation works through accumulated small influences. A slight change in word choice, strategic timing of requests, subtle environmental adjustments, or carefully placed social cues can significantly impact decisions without triggering defensive responses. The power lies in their invisibility. Consider how retail environments use micro-manipulation. Store layouts guide your path past high-margin items. Pleasant scents and music create positive associations. Eye-level product placement influences selection. Warm lighting makes you linger longer. None of these feel manipulative in the moment, yet they collectively shape your behavior. Digital platforms master micro-manipulation through interface design. The placement of buttons, choice of colors, notification timing, and even loading speeds are optimized to encourage specific actions. These dark patterns exploit psychological vulnerabilities so subtly that users rarely realize they're being influenced. The defense against micro-manipulation is heightened awareness. Pay attention to environmental factors influencing your decisions. Notice when choices feel unusually easy or when you're being gently guided. Ask yourself, why am I being presented with these specific options in this particular way? Trust your intuition when something feels off, even if you can't pinpoint exactly what's wrong. Conscious awareness is your best protection against unconscious influence. The Zeigarnik Effect reveals a fascinating aspect of human psychology. We remember interrupted or incomplete tasks better than completed ones. Named after psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, this phenomenon occurs because unfinished tasks create mental tension that keeps them active in our memory until resolved. This cognitive quirk significantly impacts how we think, feel, and behave. When we start something but don't finish it, our brains maintain an open mental file. This creates a form of psychological pressure that can be both motivating and anxiety-inducing. The unfinished task demands attention, popping into consciousness at unexpected moments and creating a sense of urgency to complete it. Marketers and content creators exploit this ruthlessly. Cliffhangers in TV shows, to be continued articles, and incomplete product demonstrations all leverage the Zeigarnik Effect. They know that unresolved tension compels us to return for completion. Social media platforms use this by showing partial content that requires clicking to see more. The effect has practical applications in productivity and learning. Breaking large tasks into smaller chunks can maintain motivation, as each incomplete subtask creates psychological tension driving you forward. However, too many open loops can become overwhelming, leading to stress and decision paralysis. Understanding the Zeigarnik Effect helps you manage both its benefits and drawbacks. Use it deliberately by starting important tasks to create momentum, but also practice closing mental loops by completing or consciously abandoning projects. Sometimes the most productive action is deciding not to finish something that no longer serves you. The Pygmalion Effect demonstrates the extraordinary power of expectations to shape reality. When someone believes in another person's potential, that belief often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, leading to improved performance that matches the higher expectations. This psychological phenomenon occurs because expectations influence behavior in subtle but profound ways. Named after the mythical sculptor who fell in love with his creation, the Pygmalion Effect was scientifically documented in classrooms. Teachers who were told certain students would bloom academically gave those students more attention, encouragement, and challenging work. The selected students, who were actually chosen randomly, subsequently performed better than their peers. The mechanism works through multiple channels. People with high expectations provide more opportunities, offer better feedback, and show more patience with mistakes. They communicate confidence through body language, tone, and word choice. Recipients internalize these positive signals, developing greater self-confidence and motivation to meet the elevated expectations. This effect operates in workplaces, relationships, and personal development. Managers who believe in their team's capabilities often see better results. Parents who expect their children to succeed create environments that foster achievement. Even our expectations of ourselves significantly impact our performance and growth. However, the opposite is equally true. Low expectations create self-fulfilling prophecies of failure. Understanding the Pygmalion Effect empowers us to consciously raise our expectations of others and ourselves. When we believe in potential, genuinely and authentically, we often help create the conditions for that potential to be realized. How we interpret failure fundamentally shapes our future success. Reframing failure isn't about positive thinking or denial, it's about choosing more productive mental frameworks that enable learning, growth, and resilience. The way we construct meaning from setbacks determines whether they become stepping stones or roadblocks. Traditional views of failure as shameful or final create psychological barriers to risk-taking and innovation. When failure means personal inadequacy, we avoid challenges that might lead to growth. But failure can be reframed as feedback, providing valuable information about what doesn't work and pointing toward better approaches. Successful entrepreneurs, athletes, and innovators consistently reframe failure as education. They ask, "What did this teach me?" instead of "Why did this happen to me?" This shift transforms failure from a verdict into a data point, maintaining motivation and forward momentum even after significant setbacks. The reframing process involves several key elements. Separating the failure from your identity, you are not your failures. Focusing on specific learnable lessons rather than broad judgments, and viewing setbacks as temporary rather than permanent. It means recognizing that failure is often a prerequisite for success, not its opposite. This mental skill can be developed through practice. When facing setbacks, consciously examine what assumptions were wrong, what skills need development, and what approaches might work better. Celebrate the courage it took to try something difficult. Remember that every expert was once a beginner who failed repeatedly. Failure becomes powerful when it becomes educational. The halo effect is a powerful cognitive bias where our impression of one characteristic influences our perception of unrelated characteristics. When we see someone or something as positive in one area, we automatically assume they're positive in others even without evidence. This mental shortcut can lead to dramatically flawed judgments and decisions. First identified in business contexts, the halo effect explains why attractive people are often perceived as more intelligent, competent, and trustworthy. It's why successful companies are assumed to excel in all areas and why popular brands can successfully launch unrelated products. Our brains create coherent narratives by filling in gaps with assumptions. The effect operates unconsciously and influences everything from hiring decisions to product purchases. A candidate who dresses well might be perceived as more qualified. A company with good customer service might be assumed to have superior products. A teacher who's friendly might be rated as more knowledgeable regardless of actual expertise. Marketing professionals exploit the halo effect constantly. Celebrity endorsements work because positive feelings toward the celebrity transfer to the product. Prestigious brand names on mediocre products boost perceived quality. Clean, professional packaging makes content seem more valuable. The danger lies in oversimplified thinking. Excellence in one area doesn't guarantee excellence in others. The most effective defense is conscious awareness of the bias and deliberate evaluation of different characteristics separately. Before making important decisions, ask yourself, am I judging this on its actual merits, or am I being influenced by unrelated positive impressions? Critical thinking requires breaking apart the halo to see clearly. Time constraints are among the most effective tools for influencing behavior and decision-making. When time becomes limited, our cognitive processes change dramatically. We shift from deliberate, analytical thinking to fast, emotional decision-making. This psychological shift makes us more susceptible to influence and more likely to make choices we might later regret. The pressure of time constraints triggers our fight-or-flight response, flooding the brain with stress hormones that impair complex reasoning while heightening emotional reactivity. Under time pressure, we rely more heavily on mental shortcuts, first impressions, and gut feelings rather than careful analysis. This state makes us vulnerable to manipulation. Salespeople, marketers, and negotiators routinely use artificial time pressure to close deals. This offer expires tonight. Limited time only. I need an answer by Friday. These tactics create urgency that overrides rational evaluation. The fear of missing out becomes stronger than the desire to make the best choice. Time constraints can be legitimate, genuine opportunities do have real deadlines. But artificial time pressure is a manipulation tactic designed to prevent you from thinking clearly. High-pressure decisions are rarely in your best interest, as they prevent you from consulting others, researching alternatives, or sleeping on important choices. The key to managing time pressure is recognizing when it's being used as a weapon against your judgment. When facing urgent decisions, ask, is this deadline real or manufactured? What would I decide if I had more time? Often, the best response to artificial urgency is to walk away entirely. The contrast principle exploits how our brains process information relationally rather than absolutely. We don't evaluate things in isolation, we judge them against whatever we've seen recently. This means that identical items can seem expensive or cheap, attractive or ugly, valuable or worthless, depending entirely on the context in which they're presented. This principle works because our brains are wired to notice differences and changes rather than absolute values. It's an evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors detect threats and opportunities. A rustling bush is only significant in contrast to stillness. Food tastes better when you're hungry compared to when you're full. Marketers and manipulators use contrast constantly. Car dealers show you the expensive model first, making the mid-range options seem reasonable. Restaurants place expensive items at the top of the menu to make everything else look affordable. Clothing stores put regular-priced items next to marked-up sale prices to create the illusion of value. The manipulation becomes more sophisticated in negotiation and sales. Starting with extreme proposals makes moderate positions seem reasonable by comparison. Showing poor quality options first makes average quality appear superior. This anchoring effect influences everything from salary negotiations to political compromises. Defense requires awareness of how contrast shapes perception. Before making decisions, consider, what am I comparing this to? How would I evaluate this if I hadn't seen the alternatives? Is this comparison meaningful or manipulative? Sometimes the best choice isn't among the options presented, it's walking away and creating your own frame of reference. The Ikea effect reveals a fundamental truth about human psychology. We disproportionately value things we've helped create, even when our contribution is minimal and the result is objectively inferior to alternatives. This cognitive bias makes us overvalue our own labor and become emotionally attached to our creations, regardless of their actual merit or quality. Named after the Swedish furniture company that requires customers to assemble their purchases, this effect was scientifically documented through experiments where people rated self-assembled items as more valuable than identical pre-assembled ones. The mere act of participation in creation increases perceived worth and emotional attachment. The psychological mechanism involves effort justification and ownership bias. When we invest time and energy into something, we need to believe it was worthwhile to maintain cognitive consistency. Additionally, the creative process makes us feel capable and accomplished, creating positive associations with the final product. Companies exploit this effect by involving customers in customization, personalization, or assembly processes. Build your own products, customizable services, and user-generated content all leverage the Ikea effect to increase customer satisfaction and loyalty. Even minimal participation can dramatically increase perceived value. The effect has positive applications in education, team building, and personal development. People learn better when actively involved in creating knowledge. Teams perform better when everyone contributes to planning. Personal goals feel more motivating when we design our own path forward. However, the Ikea effect can also lead to poor decisions when we overvalue our own work. The key is recognizing when attachment comes from effort rather than merit. The Decoy Effect is a powerful manipulation technique that uses strategically inferior options to make specific choices appear more attractive. By introducing a decoy option that's clearly worse than the target choice but similar in nature, decision-makers are nudged toward the preferred option without realizing they're being influenced. This effect works because our brains make decisions through comparison rather than absolute evaluation. When presented with multiple options, we don't assess each one independently. We compare them against each other. A skillfully designed decoy makes the target option look superior by contrast, even when it might not be the best choice overall. The classic example involves subscription pricing. A magazine might offer a digital subscription for $59, a print subscription for $125, and a digital plus print subscription for $125. The print-only option is the decoy. Nobody would choose it when they can get digital access for the same price. But its presence makes the combined option seem like incredible value. Movie theaters use this with popcorn sizes. The medium size is often priced just slightly below the large size, making the large seem like a bargain. Restaurants place expensive items on menus not expecting many people to order them, but to make other dishes appear reasonably priced. The defense against decoy effects requires recognizing when you're being presented with artificially constructed choices. Before deciding, ask yourself, what would I choose if only my top 2 options were available? Are these my only real alternatives? Often, the best choice isn't among the options presented but exists outside the artificial framework entirely. The placebo effect demonstrates the extraordinary power of belief and expectation to create real, measurable changes in our bodies and minds. When people believe they're receiving effective treatment, they often experience genuine improvements even when given inert substances. This isn't just in their heads. Placebo effects produce actual physiological changes that can be as powerful as medical interventions. The mechanism involves multiple pathways. Expectation of improvement activates the brain's reward and pain relief systems, releasing natural painkillers and mood enhancers. The ritual of treatment and attention from caregivers provides psychological comfort that supports healing. Even the mere belief that we're taking action to improve our condition can reduce stress and boost immune function. Medical research consistently shows placebo effects across numerous conditions. Pain levels decrease, depression symptoms improve, and even some physical symptoms resolve when patients believe they're receiving treatment. This is so powerful that all legitimate medical research must control for placebo effects to prove actual drug efficacy. Beyond medicine, placebo effects operate in performance, education, and daily life. Athletes perform better with performance-enhancing placebos. Students learn more effectively when told they're using advanced teaching methods. Even our mood and energy levels respond to our beliefs about what should make us feel better. Understanding placebo effects isn't about dismissing real treatments or embracing false hopes. Instead, it's about recognizing how powerfully our expectations influence our reality. The key insight is that the mind-body connection is real and can be harnessed ethically to support genuine healing and improvement. Loss aversion is one of the most powerful forces driving human behavior. We feel the pain of losing something approximately twice as strongly as the pleasure of gaining the same thing. This asymmetry in how we process gains and losses shapes everything from financial decisions to personal relationships, often leading us to make choices that aren't in our best long-term interests. This psychological principle evolved as a survival mechanism. For our ancestors, losing vital resources like food or shelter could mean death, while gaining extra resources offered less survival benefit. Our brains developed to be hypersensitive to potential losses, creating powerful emotional responses that often override rational analysis. Marketers exploit loss aversion constantly. Don't miss out. Limited time offer. You'll lose this discount. These messages trigger our fear of loss more effectively than promising equivalent gains. Insurance companies sell policies by emphasizing what you'll lose without coverage rather than what you'll gain with it. Loss aversion also explains why we stick with suboptimal situations. We stay in unsatisfying jobs because we fear losing current benefits. We hold on to declining investments because selling would realize the loss. We remain in mediocre relationships because ending them feels like losing something valuable. The key to managing loss aversion is recognizing when fear of loss is preventing beneficial changes. Sometimes losing something in the short term enables much greater gains in the long term. Ask yourself, am I making this decision based on fear of loss or potential for gain? What would I choose if I were starting fresh? The most growth often requires accepting some losses. Touch is our most primal sense, carrying profound psychological and physiological power that extends far beyond physical sensation. The experience of touch influences our emotions, decisions, and social connections in ways that operate below conscious awareness. This tactile influence can be leveraged to build trust, convey warmth, and even manipulate behavior. Human touch triggers the release of oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone, which reduces stress, increases trust, and promotes feelings of connection. This neurochemical response evolved to facilitate bonding between parents and children, but it extends to all human interactions. Even brief, appropriate touch can significantly impact how we perceive and respond to others. In professional contexts, strategic touch can influence outcomes. Research shows that brief, appropriate contact, like a handshake or pat on the shoulder, increases compliance, generosity, and positive evaluation. Servers who briefly touch customers receive larger tips. Salespeople who shake hands make more sales. Politicians who make physical contact seem more trustworthy and relatable. The power of touch extends beyond person-to-person contact. The texture and weight of objects influence our perception of their value and quality. Heavy clipboards make documents seem more important. Rough textures make tasks feel more difficult. Smooth surfaces convey luxury and sophistication. However, the power of touch can be misused. Inappropriate or manipulative physical contact violates boundaries and exploits neurological responses. The key is recognizing both the legitimate power of appropriate touch and the need for clear consent and boundaries. Understanding this influence helps us navigate social interactions more effectively while respecting others' autonomy. The foot-in-the-mouth effect is a counterintuitive psychological phenomenon where asking someone to predict their own future behavior actually makes them more likely to follow through on positive actions. When people verbally commit to doing something socially desirable, they become psychologically invested in maintaining consistency with their stated intentions. This effect works through several psychological mechanisms. First, public commitment creates social pressure to follow through, as failing to do so would threaten our self-image and reputation. Second, the act of articulating intentions makes them more concrete and memorable. Third, we have a deep psychological need for consistency between our words and actions. The technique is remarkably simple yet powerful. Instead of directly asking someone to do something, you first ask them to predict whether they'll do it. Do you think you'll vote in the upcoming election? Is more effective than please vote in the upcoming election. The prediction question makes people commit to their own stated intentions. Marketers and fundraisers use this technique regularly. Do you consider yourself someone who supports environmental causes followed by a request for donation is more effective than a direct appeal? Would you describe yourself as health conscious? Makes people more likely to choose healthy options. The effect works because it transforms external requests into internal commitments. When we predict our own behavior, we're not just complying with others' wishes, we're following through on our own stated intentions. This internal motivation is more powerful and lasting than external pressure. Understanding this effect helps in both influencing others ethically and in personal goal setting by making conscious predictions about our own desired behaviors. The endowment effect reveals how ownership fundamentally changes our perception of value. Once we own something, we value it more highly than we did before we owned it and significantly more than others who don't own it. This isn't rational, the object itself hasn't changed, but our relationship to it has, creating a powerful psychological attachment that influences our decisions. This effect occurs because ownership becomes part of our identity. The things we own aren't just objects, they're extensions of ourselves. Losing them feels like losing part of our identity, which activates loss aversion and makes us overvalue what we have. We also tend to focus on an item's positive qualities when we own it and its negative qualities when considering purchasing it. The implications extend far beyond material possessions. We overvalue our ideas because we own them. We resist changing beliefs we've held for a long time because they've become part of who we are. We stick with chosen options even when better alternatives become available because we've already psychologically invested in our choice. Retailers exploit the endowment effect through free trials, return policies, and try-before-you-buy offers. Once you've used something for a week, returning it feels like a loss rather than simply not making a purchase. Car dealers encourage test drives for the same reason. Once you've driven it, you begin to feel ownership. The key to managing the endowment effect is recognizing when ownership is clouding judgment. Before making decisions about things you already own, try to evaluate them as if you were encountering them fresh. Ask yourself, if I didn't already have this, would I choose to acquire it today? True mind control as depicted in science fiction doesn't exist, but sophisticated influence techniques can significantly shape thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without people realizing it's happening. These methods work by exploiting natural psychological vulnerabilities, cognitive biases, and social pressures to guide people towards specific choices while maintaining the illusion of free will. The most effective influence operates below conscious awareness. Rather than obvious commands, it uses subtle environmental cues, carefully crafted language patterns, and strategic timing to shape decisions. The target believes they're making independent choices, but those choices have been systematically influenced through psychological manipulation. Cults and authoritarian groups use systematic influence techniques. Isolation from outside perspectives, gradual escalation of commitment, creation of artificial scarcity and urgency, exploitation of emotional vulnerabilities, and constant reinforcement of group identity. These methods can override critical thinking and create intense loyalty to destructive ideologies. Modern technology amplifies influence capabilities. Social media algorithms can shape what information we see, gradually shifting our beliefs and preferences. Personalized advertising uses our own data to craft messages that exploit our specific psychological vulnerabilities. Deepfakes and sophisticated propaganda can create compelling false realities. The defense against systematic influence requires awareness, critical thinking, and diverse information sources. Question why you believe what you believe. Seek out perspectives that challenge your assumptions. Be suspicious of groups or individuals who discourage outside contact or critical questioning. Maintain relationships with people who think differently from you. The most important protection is recognizing that everyone, including yourself, is susceptible to influence when their psychological vulnerabilities are skillfully exploited. Playing dumb is a sophisticated psychological strategy that involves deliberately understating your knowledge, abilities, or intentions to achieve specific goals. This counterintuitive approach can be remarkably effective because it lowers others' defenses, encourages them to reveal information, and positions you as non-threatening while maintaining strategic advantage. The technique works by exploiting several psychological tendencies. People enjoy feeling superior and knowledgeable, so they're more likely to open up to someone who appears less capable. They also tend to underestimate those who seem naive or uninformed, leading them to be less guarded with sensitive information or strategic plans. In negotiations, playing dumb can be incredibly powerful. By asking innocent questions and claiming not to understand complex concepts, you can gather valuable information while your counterpart explains their position in detail. They may reveal their true priorities, constraints, or bottom line because they assume you're not sophisticated enough to use the information strategically. The strategy also works in social and professional contexts. People may share gossip, insider information, or honest opinions with someone they perceive as harmless. They might also offer help, connections, or opportunities to someone they see as needing guidance. However, playing dumb requires careful calibration. Overdoing it can make you appear genuinely incompetent, damaging your credibility and opportunities. The key is selective application, being strategically naive about specific topics while demonstrating competence in others. Use this technique ethically to gather information and build relationships, not to deceive or manipulate others for harmful purposes.